Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. And welcome to the fourth biennial Second Language Digital Literacy Symposium, what we like to call L2DL. My name is Chantelle Warner. I'm an associate professor of German studies and second language acquisition and teaching at the University of Arizona. And I'm also one of the two co-directors of CERCLL, who is the host for this event. CERCLL, the Center for Educational Resources in Culture, Language, and Literacy, is one of 16 Title VI National Foreign Language Resource Centers, and we're funded by the Department of Education. And we have a collective mission to support language education in the US and beyond through research, materials development, professional development, and through events like this, which give us an opportunity to exchange new knowledge, best practices related to the teaching and learning of languages. If L2DL is the first event that's brought you to CERCLL, and if this is the first time that you're hearing about the National Foreign Language Resource Centers, I encourage you to take a moment sometime soon to peruse our websites. We all offer different things collectively, but a wealth of resources for people working in language education. And we'll also pop those links into the chat here in a little bit so that you can access them more easily. One thing I want to highlight in particular as an upcoming event with CERCLL is that we have a webinar series starting just next month that is focusing on literacy-based lesson planning. It's free. It'll be similar in format to this. So if that's something you might also be interested in, please do register, and we look forward to seeing you there too. So turning to today's event, this is, as I said, the fourth L2DL. Since its inception in 2012, this symposium has put the affordances of digital literacy front and center, both thematically and in practice. This is the first fully online L2DL, but it's always been a digitally mediated event. And leading up to this year's symposium, and at this very moment where pretty much all of us are starting to think about what it means to shift these interactions that we typically have had in co-present spaces online, I've been reflecting a lot about the now 8-year history of us using digital technologies to overcome various kinds of obstacles to mobility and to facilitate new ways of engaging with one another. Especially how this is impacting academic conference life at kind of a rapid rate at the moment, but this is something that we've been kind of experimenting with through this conference for a while. As many of the presenters have reminded us in their talks this week, virtual exchange is not a panacea. It often serves to reframe rather than erase questions of access and inequity. But at the same time, it was becoming clear, I think even before this pandemic, that we need to find more ways to connect that don't reinforce and exacerbate existing financial inequities or perpetuate harm to the planet. And I'm not suggesting that we figured this out. That's definitely not the claim I want to make. But I think one of the most powerful aspects of the L2DL symposium for me has always been that it strives to create this space where we can practice what we teach in this regard. And participating in the live chats and the synchronous discussions around the presentations this week has really affirmed for me the value of virtual exchange as pedagogical practice, but also as academic practice. And so I'm looking forward to the ongoing discussions today and tomorrow and to continuing this. I'm now going to turn this over to Liudmila Klimanova, my colleague, who is an assistant professor in Russian and second language acquisition and teaching here at the University of Arizona. And she's the lead organizer for this year's L2DL event.
Hello and welcome. On behalf of the organizing committee for this year's L2DL conference, I would like to welcome you to this event. This is our first day of live streaming events. And this year's symposium focuses on the intersection of digital literacies and virtual intercultural education, as Chantelle just mentioned. But we're also looking at the critical dimensions of virtual exchange in connection to equity, social justice, diversity movements in the world. And when we were planning this event last year, we could not even imagine to what extent the words critical and virtual and digital would be timely in the context of COVID and the global pandemic, and a fast-growing movement toward online and distance teaching modalities around the world. And we look forward to this upcoming 2 days of events and sessions and conversations on the topic of intercultural education and virtual exchange. As many of you know, and as I already noted, this is our first day of live streams and networking events. We have a great lineup of invited speakers for you and panels, and we also added a few special events focusing on the current situation in the world. And these events will provide an opportunity for all participants to hear and voice concerns about the state of intercultural virtual education today in the world of COVID. We are particularly pleased to see so many virtual attendees this year. We have 488 registered participants as of today, coming from 55 countries and teaching 28 different languages. 23 paper proposals were selected to be included in a week-long schedule of virtual presentations and discussions on the topics of digital literacies and virtual exchange. We also have 5 invited presentations and panels and 3 Zoom networking sessions for you. I would like to take a moment and highlight our main live stream events today. Today and tomorrow. So today we are holding 2 live streaming sessions, a plenary session and a panel. And tomorrow we will have our second plenary talk and 2 panel discussions. And in addition to these events, we organized this year 3 networking sessions for social interactions, for networking, for looking for partners and collaborators. Please take advantage of these opportunities and connect with the colleagues across the globe, find partners, share your concerns, and continue conversations. We will start with our live streaming sessions. I would like to take a moment to thank all the people who helped make this event possible this year. Our symposium organizing committee, our scientific committee who read and reviewed all submitted proposals, our College of Humanities IT staff who are now behind the scenes working on the technical logistical details of these events. We have a group of doctoral students in second language acquisition and teaching who will give a state of the field report on the topic of digital literacies and virtual exchange tomorrow. Many things go to CERCLL, Center for Educational Resources and Culture, Language Literacy at the University of Arizona for organizing this event from beginning to end, for making this event accessible to everyone. And my special thanks go to Kate Mackay, CERCLL Associate Director, and Hochio Coronado Vargas, CERCLL Program Coordinator, for all the work they're doing behind the scenes, contacting presenters, responding to your emails, helping with online access. Without you, this event would not have been such a success. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I now have the pleasure of introducing our first invited speaker, Dr. Shannon Sauro. Dr. Sauro holds a PhD in educational linguistics from the University of Pennsylvania and was awarded the title of docent from Malmö University. She's a specialist in technologically mediated language teaching and learning at the Department of Education at the University of Maryland at Baltimore County. Originally from Montreal, Canada, she was raised and educated in the United States and has taught in Japan, the United States, and Sweden. Dr. Sauro's areas of research include the intersection of online FAN practices, language learning and teaching, the role of virtual exchange, and telecollaboration in language teacher education. She's the author of numerous publications, editor of the books Call for Mobility, the Handbook of Technology and Second Language Teaching and Learning with Carol Chappell, the special issue of Language Learning and Technology with Katrina Zuro on Call in the Digital Wilds. She sits on the editorial boards of 3 flagship journals in the field of applied linguistics, TESOL Quarterly, Language Learning and Technology, and Gallico Journal. As an international researcher, she's active in 2 European-funded projects, fan fiction for the teaching and application of languages through e-stories and evidence-based online learning, through virtual exchange, EVOLV. And Dr. Sauro is a past president of Calico, the computer-assisted language instruction consortium, and is currently communications officer for Uni Collaboration, an international organization for virtual exchange. She has published widely on the topics related to intercultural education, then telecollaboration, virtual exchange, and collaborative online international learning. And her work appeared in many journals. Dr. Sauro's talk today is entitled Measuring the Impact of Virtual Exchange, Student Learning Outcomes for the EVOLV Project. Please join me in welcoming virtually Dr. Shannon Sauro.
Thank you, Liudmila. I appreciate being invited to talk today. I'm only sorry I'm not out there in person. but I'm really pleased to see the large number of folks joining us internationally, including some of the people involved in the research that I'm about to present. So today I'm going to be talking about student learning outcomes from the EVOLV project. And I want to point out that this is the work of a European project, which actually brings together partners, 12 partner institutions from 8 European countries with the aim of mainstreaming virtual exchange as an innovative form of collaborative international learning across disciplines and higher education institutions. So specifically, I'm going to be sharing the findings that come out of this project, but you'll see images and names of the many researchers who were involved in the work that I'm presenting here. And those of you who attended some of the talks earlier this week also had a chance to encounter some of the other EVOLV people speaking here, and in fact, some of the virtual exchanges that were part of this study. So a little bit more on the purpose and goals of EVOLV. So we see in Europe, of course, a strong interest in promoting internationalization of education. And there's been a lot of work on virtual exchange. However, there's also been an impetus to grow virtual exchange across the disciplines. So the goal of EVOLV was basically to promote awareness and implementation of virtual exchange in 3 ways. First, by implementing online collaborative training and accreditation for educators. This is the training arm of EVOLV. Secondly, through conducting state-of-the-art research to measure impact at the student, educator, and institutional levels. And finally, to engage with policy and decision makers to demonstrate good virtual exchange practices. So you'll see highlighted here in blue, this is what I'll be talking about today. So it is in fact only a small portion of what EVOLV encompasses. And even still, I'm approaching this kind of in a filtered way through my own lens of interpretation. And I want to point you to a resource where you'll be able to find what I'm talking about. So the results that I'm sharing today are in the soon to be published Impact of Virtual Exchange on Student Learning in Higher Education report, which will be coming out hopefully in November. I believe I saw a tweet on that just today, and will be published to this site of the website for EVOLV. I've just tweeted about it, but you can see the link here. You can also see the link in my own Whova update. But another thing that you can also find on this page, the resource page in particular, are some of the research tools that I'll be talking about a little bit later, the instruments that were used in this study. All right, let's get to what we did. So this was a multi-country, multi-discipline project that was carried out between September 2019 and April 2020. So what we found, or what we had, were 16 different virtual exchange projects that took place sometime during this time period. These virtual exchanges consisted of 34 partners, 33 of whom participated in the research, and they represented 20 different countries, which you can see here on the map. Of these 16 virtual exchanges, the vast majority, 14 of them, were dyads between just 2 partner countries. 2 of them were triads between 3 partner countries. For instance, there was one between Sweden, Poland, and Argentina. Now, as I mentioned, one of the goals of this project was to reach out across disciplines and promote virtual exchange, not just in the language areas, but in other areas. And what we're able to report is of these 16 exchanges, the classes and the partnerships came from the areas of education, e-learning, foreign languages, intercultural competence, language and literature, language for the disciplines, for example, English for chemical engineering or English for tourism, management, multimodal discourse, and teacher training. Now, there was a wide range of duration for these different virtual exchanges, and they carried out a variety of different tasks that fit within the needs and goals of the specific partners. So the average duration of the tasks was, of the partnerships was 7.5 weeks. But we can see, again, a huge difference, in part because, as you can tell by the dates, some of them ran into COVID and had to alter or adapt as their universities began adapting to the pandemic. Now to look a little bit more at what we did. So we collected different types of data, and I'll be presenting examples of both types here as I go through the 5 main areas of this project. we had quantitative data and analysis that was carried out on pre and post virtual exchange surveys. So we had a total of 248 students who completed both the pre and post surveys, and for which we were able to gather statistical data. These were self-report items in the different areas using a 5-point Likert scale, and were compared or evaluated using paired t-tests. Now, in addition, the same surveys also included open-ended questions that students were asked to, and you'll see some of these prompts later on, were asked to share an example from their virtual exchange of some sort of learning that happened. So for them to actually recall an example. This was augmented with semi-guided interviews that were carried out with 19 students who represented 10 of the 16 virtual exchanges. These were generally interviews in the form of about an hour, again, conducted virtually for the most part. And in addition, we also had a subset of virtual exchanges, 6 of them, which incorporated portfolios as part of their assessment or task process. And so we were able to collect data or analyze the qualitative responses on 116 of these. So what I'm going to be reporting here are, I would say, a taste of the results in 5 parts. And these 5 parts reflect the 5 components of the surveys and the areas that we were looking at. So you can see the first is core learning outcomes. The second, which is very familiar to many of us who've done virtual exchange and telecollaboration, is intercultural competence. Then we have critical digital literacy, which aligns with the themes of criticality, of the very familiar language skills, since many of us are in the language disciplines, and finally the broader area of disciplinary skills. So what I'm going to be presenting for each of these areas is a brief background or what they looked at, a brief overview of the quantitative data, and then some of the qualitative examples that really stood out to me that I want to highlight. And I'd like to point out, there is so much more in this report, and this is at best a taste because I only have 40 minutes to talk to you. But there's much more detail in the final report. So the first section on core learning outcomes was the initial section on the survey that was meant to get not only at students' general learning experiences in the virtual exchange, but also to find out more about how things went, again, to kind of collect a little bit of that background data. But we also asked for general learning outcomes that were not meant to be specifically tied to the other 4 areas that came later. So of these outcomes, or of the questions, we had 4 of the 6 items that students were asked on the quantitative side showed a significant increase from pre to post test. So you can see the example items here. But I want to focus a little bit on a few of the other things that came out in response to the students' open-ended questions. What we saw was students were able to identify, when they talked about their general learning experience, they were able to appreciate and recognize that the virtual exchange provided them with a wide range of opportunities, often with respect to skills associated with their course. So we had students who recognized that it allowed them to expand their skills as a teacher, or to improve their technological skills, or to practice their language skills, to work with people from different countries, to negotiate ideas and different views about societies, and to learn about other cultures and ways of seeing the world. In addition, though, students also recognize that the virtual exchange provided them the opportunity to develop more general or transferable skills that had an impact on their personal development or perhaps even personality traits. So some pointed out, for instance, it provided them the opportunity to improve their skills and to get to know their weaknesses, to meet people, work with them, and broaden their horizons, to talk with foreign friends and rethink what we previously never think, to investigate a theme related to the city, perhaps the city in which they were studying, in more detail and to think more critically about it, and to develop a better intercultural competence and therefore the ability to adapt. So in sum, the core learning outcomes pointed to virtual exchange activities having a positive effect on learning across all investigated domains, and that there were significant statistical results in two domains: collaboration skills and intercultural competence. I want you to hold these in mind because obviously we're going to see these emerge later in other elements that I'm going to talk about. And finally, for the majority of students, disciplinary learning objectives and personal learning objectives were both met through their experience of virtual exchange. The second area I want to look at is, of course, intercultural competences. And this draws upon the Council of Europe's definition of competence for democratic culture. Specifically, they define intercultural competence as the ability to mobilize and deploy relevant values, attitudes, skills, knowledge, and/or understanding in order to respond appropriately and effectively to the demands, challenges, and opportunities that are presented by democratic and intercultural situations. The quantitative items, or the results of the pre and post-test comparison of the quantitative items, showed a significant increase on only 5 of the 9 subcompetencies investigated. You can see those are bolded in black. Now, for some of these, such as their interest in learning about other people, where we did not see a significant increase, this may have been because their pre-test scores were already extremely high. But this was not the case with all other items. And in fact, there were a few themes that emerged that students discussed that may have mitigated or mediated their learning in these other areas. The first theme I want to point to is that of interpersonal relationships. So we've seen often in other research on virtual exchange that the social element is particularly important, and that making new friends and connections is something that many students often look forward to and consider a potentially positive outcome. What we found, however, is that sometimes the project or the tasks that they were involved in during their virtual exchange kept them so busy or led to situations that kept them from developing the interpersonal relationships they wanted. So we can see here, the data confirm what previous studies in the literature have pointed out, that participants in this type of experience often consider their peers as people who matter. However, sometimes in the case where the task or frustration around the task got in the way, it influenced their successful development of interpersonal skills. And I have a quote from a student who illustrates this. This example of unsuccessful interpersonal relationships leading to misguided generalizations. The student says, virtual exchange can be extremely positive as long as you find good partners. If there's someone in your group who does not want to work, no matter how many times you explain it to her, it makes it very complicated and it's honestly not worth it. It was also observed that there seemed to be a pattern throughout the exchanges that even in groups where there was successful interpersonal relationships, these could become strained when there was a strong emphasis on the task. But once that academic issue had been resolved and tension dropped, many of these negative tensions and negative feelings towards the other were left behind. A second theme that emerged has to do with the technology itself. I'm calling this here modality and context. And what we see increasingly, of course, is the use of video-based communication technologies in virtual exchanges becoming more normalized. Although, however, we see they also can be very problematic for certain students and for participation due to time zone differences, but also inequality in access to high consistent internet connections where they can engage in consistent Zoom or Skype meetings. However, what the data that we highlight here show is that whenever possible, video conferencing should be incorporated into virtual exchanges in order to support the development of partner relationships and more fluid communication, which can have a positive influence on intercultural competence. Here's an example of what we mean. Online video communication sometimes or often was remarked upon as leading to friendlier, more fluid communication and less intercultural misunderstandings. Here's what one student says, comparing the difference between video conferencing and text-based information. So it's easy to get angry, for example, with words. It's hard to get angry in front of someone. It's more easy to express feelings with calm when we see each other and when we're in a synchronous conversation, when we speak at the same time. But when we have a text-based forum, it's harder to communicate, to be more understandable, I think. So to wrap up with the major outcomes pulled from the intercultural competence subgroup, the EVOLV dataset provided evidence for virtual exchange's potential for developing the following: skills for successful intercultural interaction and collaboration in online settings, the ability to manage and resolve conflicts in online contexts, and aspects of cultural knowledge, as well as adaptability to cultural perspectives and practices different to one's own, and a critical understanding of cultures, a reflection of one's own perceptions and a distancing from some of one's worldviews. I've highlighted some aspects here in blue, but one word that I've highlighted that we are going to see again a couple of more times is this concept of adaptability. But before we get to that, I want to take us to the third area of knowledge and skills that we investigated, and that was critical digital literacy. And here we see definition is based upon or draws upon Darwin, 2017, where critical digital literacy examines how digital context shape ways of thinking, knowledge, identities, and social relations in ways that often privilege some and marginalize others. So here we see elements of not just what digital tools to use to be more effective, but also an awareness of power and also a thinking not only of the self and your own privileges brought to you, but what this means for the partners in your exchange. Within the quantitative items, we see that 7 of the 8, so all but 1, showed a statistically significant change from pre to post test. And that is the one I am going to focus on in particular, which states I'm able to support others in establishing and maintaining their online presence in similar ways. The one that did not show a significant increase from pre to post test. We recognize, or analysis showed, there was in fact analysis or examples that students could provide where they did in fact do this in the qualitative data we collected, particularly in the reflection portfolio. You recall that a subset of the partnerships used a reflection portfolio. And on that portfolio, there was a specific prompt that asked students to give an example from their virtual exchange that illustrates how they helped another participant to establish their presence or find their voice. And what was found is that when prompted to do so, students were indeed able to identify ways in which they did this. For instance, some pointed out examples of how they helped others participate by stepping back. A student says, I had to step back a bit to not take over, since all 3 of my group members were on the quiet side. Still others reflected on what they would do differently in future exchanges, should they be involved in virtual exchange again. One said they would try not to sound forward too much and would allow their partners to steer the conversation more. Another example that we see emerging from the qualitative data were examples of students actively helping others find their voice, in some cases through strategic use of technology. This showed that participants were alert to the individual needs of their group members and drew upon this awareness to help their peers find their voice through several strategies. This included giving them space, giving them praise, and giving them encouragement. I have 2 examples I want to show here. The first is an example of encouragement, where one student described reaching out to one of their group members who felt neglected through a different platform, and by having a private conversation alongside the whole group conversation. This is something I think many of us who find ourselves engaged in a lot of online teaching and online meetings may also see ourselves doing, in an online meeting, WhatsApping a colleague that looks like they're having a bit of a problem. So we saw the students aware and actually engaging in encouragement that way. But we also see examples of giving students space and persistence. Participants were mindful of technology difficulties and acknowledged that it was important to not give up on other people during delays or difficulties in communicating. In other words, the variation, the inequality in digital access or stability that we may have seen in different partnerships was something these students were aware of and actively considered in order to ensure other members of their group had a voice. The main findings that we see coming out of critical digital literacy include the following: that reflecting upon the impact of the choice of communication methods on the virtual exchange was actually rather challenging for participants. Instead, most simply explained what they did rather than reflect upon the impact of what they did. In other words, there was a lack of reflection that they were able to engage in. In addition, there was a tendency where completion of the tasks that they had to get done to finish the virtual exchange, were prioritized almost to the exclusion of a focus upon the ongoing exchange experience itself. So here we see a parallel to the intercultural competence team, where elements of the task can lead to tensions where other opportunities for learning may be put at the wayside while students focus on this task completion goal. The fourth area I want to present is the one that will probably be most familiar to all of us here, and that's language skills. The definitions and competences we use drew upon the Common European Framework of Reference and the 2018 companion volume of revised descriptors to get at the skills and knowledge that language learners need to develop in order to use a foreign or second language effectively for communication in different domains to perform different tasks. Now, one thing I want to point out about the language set, and because I was involved in this team of researchers, we knew going into this study that not all participants would identify as language learners. Indeed, that was the nature of pulling across a wide range of disciplines. There were many examples of what we might consider lingua franca exchanges that include highly proficient speakers of the language of the virtual exchange who did not have as a learning goal either for their course or personally the development of any language skills. So we weren't sure what would happen when we investigated this both quantitatively and qualitatively. Interestingly, or perhaps not too interestingly, there were 10 subcompetencies that we investigated, and they're listed here. And on 8 of the 10, we saw a significant difference from pre to post test. The only 2 where we did not see a significant increase was in the area of vocabulary range and the area of adapting and mediating. And again, I mentioned we'd see adapting again, and this is one that I will focus on in just a moment. But before I do that, I want to focus on the subcompetence of competence. This is one that we don't always see investigated in studies of language learning and virtual exchange, but many of us who have engaged or choose to bring virtual exchange into our classes do so because we recognize it is an opportunity for many of our learners to gain confidence in the language. So here, competence refers to the attitude adopted by second language speakers during communication in the target language, and it encompasses anxiety as an emotion linked to the very specific context of foreign language practice, but also enjoyment when students realize that they managed to overcome their initial fear or lack of confidence. And we did indeed see a significant increase, but also quite a fair number of references to how the virtual exchange facilitated the development of their confidence in the qualitative answers. Here's one where a student points to the value of the experience itself and the value of having successful communication in the language of the virtual exchange, building confidence. I think that through this virtual exchange, I broke my language barrier. I'm aware that my spoken English still isn't very well, but I'm certain that online meetings made me think now, immediately, without any hesitation. So I learned to be more spontaneous and courageous to tell what I think. Sometimes it's better to tell anything, maybe with some mistakes, but it gives a chance to be understood instead of being shy and not being heard. The second theme I want to point to under language is, as I mentioned, one of the 2 subcompetences that did not achieve statistical significance on the post test, and that is adapting. Interestingly, what we found when we evaluated the qualitative responses and did a frequency analysis was reference to adapting being the 4th most frequently mentioned subcompetence out of all. And we saw various examples that illustrated why. For instance, we had students who pointed to the fact that they were able to adapt their language for intelligibility when interacting with their peers. One student said, "I was able to alter my way of communication in English to be more intelligible to my peers. For example, I noticed how I got more responses for my group members when I spoke slower, clearer, and asked." Another thing that stood out was the fact that for students for whom the partnership, the virtual exchange, was not intended to be a language learning experience, whether these were students who were higher in proficiency in the language itself and therefore felt there was not much they could learn from their peers, or students who identified even as native speakers of the language of the virtual exchange, we saw evidence of how they were able to develop in their adaptability for the purpose of communication. And here we have an example of one where the student says that during the course of this project, I had to explain varying concepts and ideas to my partner, but I had to explain them in a way that was easy to understand. As a result, I had to rethink and rephrase some of my ideas in a way that I would normally not even consider doing. So to bring together the language skills in some, the findings do correspond with those of prior studies on language learning regarding the development of the subcompetencies of understanding or reception, vocabulary knowledge, and interaction. Quantitative results in particular indicated the development of communication ability, confidence, propositional precision and thematic development, goal-oriented collaboration, spoken fluency, and grammatical range and control, while the qualitative results indicated the development of production and adapting, particularly among high proficiency and native speaking participants. And now I move to the fifth and final sub-area that we investigated in the study, and that is disciplinary skills, which is defined here as the skills and knowledge taught and assessed in university courses and which are considered relevant for the academic discipline. So from the outset, you recall the goal of EVOLV, or one of the goals, was to upscale virtual exchange in higher education across a wider range of disciplines than many of the language-related disciplines that we often see it in. For this reason, the development of the quantitative component of the surveys was more limited because we couldn't anticipate what disciplines would be taking part. For this reason, we had just one item, and it did indeed show a significant change from pre to post test. That was, students explained that they were competent in the knowledge and skills identified by the course objectives. So at the end of the virtual exchange, they felt their competence in their disciplinary knowledge and skills had increased. What followed then was analysis of the qualitative responses that students provided to see if they could tease out other patterns that emerged. And what stood out, if we think back to the various disciplines that were relevant and related, that the one discipline that seemed to have the largest number of respondents, where enough conclusions could be drawn about the disciplinary competencies, was in the area of teacher education. So this was a frequency list that was related specifically to this discipline of the disciplinary competencies that students identified. This included developing activities, discovering digital tools, improving teaching methods, intercultural teaching, adapting to students' needs, see there's adapting again, supervising students, and then at the end, assessing students' work. We can see an example or two examples of this coming from students in teacher education, where one student pointed to the fact that the activity of the virtual exchange helped improve knowledge of teaching methods. And he said, for instance, we were talking about the research of Gibbons and O'Dowd from 2015, and also talking about Vygotsky and his idea of the zone of proximal development, and just how we need to teach specifically, to the strengths of teach to the zone of proximal development of the students. So those of us here who are teachers, this sounds very familiar, and it's kind of gratifying to see a student articulating that this knowledge was strengthened through his virtual exchange. At the same time, we see students pointing to other skills that are valuable for teacher education. One says the ability to adapt to student needs was a learned outcome. The student says, I've learned more about how to invite quieter students into a conversation, taking initiatives and making compromises. And when we think in particular about this move towards increased online teaching, for many of us during the pandemic, this is a powerful skill for the student to have developed as a result of the virtual exchange. Now, although the other groups of students, I guess we could say there was a critical mass of those in teacher education that allowed for the teasing out of these disciplinary competencies. But in the other areas, what we also saw emerging outside of education is a second group of competencies that emerged that were not typically associated with specific disciplines. These were the transversal skills, or transversal knowledge and skills and competencies which are relevant to a broad range of occupations and economic sectors, often referred to as core skills, basic skills, or soft skills, and are the cornerstone of the personal development of a person. One example of these transversal skills that was frequently mentioned was the development of skills for group work. Here's an example from one student. During the project, we had several disagreements, so we had to fix things as a group in order to move forward with the assigned tasks. That made us confront each other about the goals that each one had individually, and that perhaps had a direction contrary to that of the project. Now, many of us who work in virtual exchange have no doubt encountered this situation where students engage in a project that leads to a high degree of conflict, where sometimes the teacher gets involved. Here, though, we see the students strategizing ways to figure out how they could move forward and deal with confrontation in order to successfully carry out their project. So this is one example of the transversal skills. So in sum, the disciplinary skills findings point to the fact that for teacher education, which was the largest discipline represented in the virtual exchange pool, virtual exchange not only supported disciplinary skill development, but also the development of transversal skills. For all other disciplines, the majority of gains was in the area of transversal learning, specifically in the areas of communicative competence, intercultural competence, group work, self-management, and digital competence. So I want to pull things together by pointing to several trends or themes that emerged for me as I look through the EVOLV data, or this taste of EVOLV data. What I see, for instance, is further evidence in support of virtual exchange to support teacher education. This aligns, for example, with the results that came out of another European project, large-scale project, specifically on virtual exchange for teacher education, called Evaluate. What we also see is clear reference to the development of transversal skills that emerged in several of the 5 focal areas of our surveys that we investigated. This is a growing area of interest, indeed, because often we'll hear people talk about the fact, incidentally, anecdotally, that we know that virtual exchange can facilitate transversal skill development. But here we see this happening quite frequently over and over again in students' own words. Thirdly, we also see that virtual exchange, or the evidence that the virtual exchange can support language development across language levels, including specifically adapting even among high proficiency users of the language of the virtual exchange. Fourth, we also see evidence of the impact of video conferencing that it can have on the development of intercultural competencies, something to consider pursuing further when possible. And fifth, we also see the value of teacher guidance in the virtual exchange to support awareness of learning. This harkens back to the issue that we saw with critical digital literacies, where students on the quantitative items may not have indicated that they were able to give voice to other students, but once they were asked in a more reflective way, as they had to do on their reflection portfolios, they were indeed able to articulate and become aware of this process. And so with that, I'm going to conclude my talk and point you to, once again, the EVOLV website, which we can see up here at the top. And for more information, you can certainly email EVOLV. And here is the list of the 12 partner institutions who were involved in the project. And I think with that, I'm ready to take questions.
Thank you so much for your insightful talk, Shannon. We have a few questions that came in the chat function. I will read them to you. And I have also a few questions. The first question is from Suzanne, and she's referring to one of the outcomes you mentioned in your talk, critical understanding of one's culture and worldview. And she's asking, were there exercises that promoted this outcome, promoted this competence, or did this just happen because of the exchange?
So if the question is asking whether, how can I say this? We did not have control we did not have control over what the teachers did with their specific students in the virtual exchange. So it is indeed possible that we may have had teachers who brought in elements of this kind of critical reflection and specifically embedded it in their exchange. So we could not evaluate that or quantify that, since we didn't ask teachers, give us all your lesson plans so we see everything that you're doing. We did have initial collection sheets where we got information where they explained the focus of their exchange, the level, the discipline, that sort of thing. And that could give some idea that there were maybe some that had that potential element. But again, the data that we're presenting here, for the most part, when it comes out of these pre and post virtual exchange surveys, it was asking the students to reflect on what they perceived that they had learned. And many of the examples that students wrote did in fact point to things that happened during the exchange and not during class outside the exchange, if you know what I mean. So I hope that addresses the question that Suzanne had.
Thank you. Yes, Suzanne has another question, and I think she's asking about any modification that were made in those virtual exchanges that you were looking at. And her question is this: are these outcomes different than the outcomes from traditional exchanges?
I'm not sure what's meant by traditional exchanges. Does she mean other types of virtual exchanges, or?
I think so. Yes.
Okay. So like I said, there wasn't one, the virtual exchanges that we had here were indeed the partnering of university classes, and often they followed, many of them had gone through a type of training, but this also included people who'd been doing virtual exchange for a while, and incorporated some elements of task completion, whether it was like an introduction task, or you saw in one of the example quotes, a student talking about being more familiar with the city that they lived in. That was a task out of one of the virtual exchanges, which was called reading the city. So I don't know how to compare that like to a traditional, if we're thinking in models of telecollaboration where people may have said, okay, like tandem telecollaborations where one is correcting another student's writing, where you take turns in the two languages, so like a French university and a German university. There may have been elements of that also in these virtual exchanges because we did have language partnerships. So what I want to point out is including more disciplines meant we probably had a wider variety of the kind of activities that we would find in a virtual exchange than we might see if we went back to the older call literature on telecollaboration.
Thank you, Shannon. I think Suzanne just clarified that her question. She says, I mean physical exchanges. Perhaps she means exchanges as we think about students moving to different locations to have this educational component in an intercultural setting.
Okay. Well, I think we can see a clear difference in that when we look at the critical digital literacy, because often when you have physical mobility and those exchanges that you're interacting and your world is not mediated to the same degree or as exclusively through technology as it was in these partnerships. So this was, again, something quite different. And another thing that we find, again, pointing back to the triads. So we had most of these were dyadic virtual exchanges, but some were not. And you could see that brought in 3 countries of students, and not all students are from that specific locality. That just happened to be where they were studying. But we brought in multiple perspectives and not just one other perspective. And that was often something that students found really both challenging but enriching to deal with.
Well, this is very fascinating. We have another question about the data that you collected from these surveys. Carmen is asking, do you have data regarding how the exchange projects were integrated into the course grade and assessment?
I think this was something we may have asked but did not receive answers from all the partnerships. So for instance, some of them would have used the portfolios as a form of assessment. And so that was an indication for us. But many of the, as we saw, the majority of the virtual exchange partnerships did not use portfolios. So they would have assessed things differently. There is an element to EVOLV that I'm not talking about here, and that has to do with research on virtual exchange with the teachers. So we have a subset, and that's a whole other section with research coming out and a report coming out where I think you would see more of that information about how the teachers incorporated virtual exchange, what kind of assessment practices they used, and what they saw that worked and didn't work. So I'm afraid I can't speak on that here, but that is something that you will be able to find shortly as well on the EVOLV website.
Boris is asking, have you received notice of partner teachers, students developing ways to minimize possible miscommunication in written conversations, such as a recurring use of emojis and other multimodal semiotic resources? I think his question is about your finding that miscommunications were analyzed as an outcome, as a learning outcome from the exchange.
So if I'm trying to think back to the data that I analyzed. So again, I looked in particular at language, and I would see examples where students would have provided vignettes of learning that occurred. And often what they may have pointed to, so we saw with the example of adapting, that a student may have in a spoken, like a video conferencing interaction, slowed down, found new ways of saying things. We also saw reference to other digital tools that some had incorporated. So it wasn't necessarily the use of emojis, although we did see reference to emojis as a way to mediate more for intercultural learning, where students were trying to provide, to encourage their peer through friendliness and try to help them feel more confident by using smiley faces in that way. So that was not mediating a miscommunication so much as emotional management. So the peer relationship that was developing. But we did see there were a variety of strategies, and it depended in part on the exchange. So there was one that stands out in my mind of a partnership between a US institution and a Japanese institution, where one of the students, again, the purpose of that was a language exchange. And there was a reliance on language skills or tools or clarifications in different modalities that one student I can recall talking about.
Excellent. We have another question on a very related note. Malina is asking, were there aspects of power noticeable in how students perceived the use of English as lingua franca in their transcultural groups? So the question is about, I guess, power dynamic in those exchanges. Were you looking at that when you were analyzing the surveys?
I think we saw elements of that coming through a little bit when students were talking about proficiency or adapting, but our students didn't really use what I read. So my colleagues who were dealing more with the critical digital literacy may have better examples, since their questions would have elicited that. The students what I read, they didn't articulate the power differential as much. It was maybe more like, well, because they speak a different kind of English, I slowed down. So like they were knowledgeable of proficiency to that degree. So I would say on my end, what I know is limited, but I think, again, this is something that will be dealt with more in detail in the final report. So I would recommend the critical digital literacy section as being the one to focus on there.
Excellent. Well, in this connection, I also have a question. I was intrigued to not see any reported outcomes on vocabulary range, and this is in the section on language. I wonder how do you explain this finding? Because I could imagine that students should be developing vocabulary rather than not developing, especially in virtual exchanges.
Yep. So this is what I want to point out. I think what we're seeing here is an artifact of the population that we had, where we had many high proficiency people, because vocabulary range was indeed one of the items frequently referenced in the qualitative data. And so this is where I think we see those who got into a partnership for the purpose of learning language were often able to point to vocabulary development. But others who were in lingua franca exchanges, or who were maybe in an exchange where there was a high differential in language ability, didn't develop new vocabulary. So that was not what they mentioned. They may have mentioned other things. So I think that's the explanation, because again, it seems to contradict what we found from other research on virtual exchange, that vocabulary range is definitely one that people develop. And so I think it has to do with the fact that we weren't dealing with only people whose goal was language learning or who identified as language learners.
Mm-hmm. And on a related note, with adaptability, as you were presenting, I was thinking, how can we measure adaptability? Is it something more qualitatively subjective, or there is an objective measure?
Well, we were definitely looking at certain things that our students or the participants invoked, and often they would use modification, adaptability, or if they provided examples of how they changed their speech or writing as a way to communicate or be more comprehensible to someone else. So often it was not, it wasn't that, yeah, it showed kind of an other awareness of a change. And it was interesting to see that this was indeed something that students remarked on as a language learning example, that they actually qualitatively pulled that out. I did this thing and that's what worked. I don't know of a better measure, but I do see so much adaptability. I think you heard me pointing that out, that was a recurring theme in different ways in several of these elements of the results.
Well, this is interesting indeed. We have a few questions about the methodology and more kind of the methodological shape of this fascinating research. And my question is, this is a question coming from me. At the beginning, you mentioned that you were looking at different types of pairings. So there were pairs, participants coming from 2 countries, but there were also multiple groups of participants coming from 3 countries participating in one single exchange. I wonder if you looked at this as a setup, as a factor influencing the outcomes, the learning outcomes reported by your participants.
So for the purpose of the EVOLV report that I'm presenting here, we have not looked at that, but what we've identified are certain areas going forward, because exactly as you point out, these triads tended to be much more about lingua franca, and even if you had a group in there who had mastery of the language being used, they were outnumbered and not really, they didn't possess any specialized knowledge that was unique. In a way, they needed to come together and understand because of the larger group dynamics. So this is something that we're interested, even though EVOLV is ending, I believe there is investigation, or my colleague Sake, who's the project leader, and this is coming out of the lead partner, the University of Groningen. I think there is interest in making, where possible, some of the data available for future analysis, that we could investigate questions like this, because again, there were a lot of background pieces of knowledge collected in the core aspects to see about variation in the partnerships. And we haven't done that cross analysis at this point yet.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. There is another question on a somewhat related note from Chantelle. She says she can ask questions, but this is what she wrote. I would be interested to hear Shannon talk about some of the benefits and limits of using the CEFR to shape the data collection.
Oh, well, it's really gigantic. And one of the things we wanted, as you can see, this being a European project, you'll note that we start with many European documents and build on prior knowledge that the European Commission has funded. It also represents a common point of knowledge among the people who were not just researchers, but most of our partnerships, again, because it was funded out of Europe, it had many people who were trained using the CEFR. So this was like a known framework. So it had benefits in that regard. On a personal level, some of the things that I found frustrating, of course, is how the minutia. So I want to go back. We did a pilot study. This is not something I presented here, but the development of all of our survey items were piloted the prior year with about 6 virtual exchanges. So we were able to test out different elements. And what we found based on just the language area, that we looked to the literature to decide, what are the skills most likely to be developed. And what we found was that what we thought students would identify was different than what they actually identified. So we actually had to rewrite our entire assumptions. But there were certain things that did work, both in the pre-test and the post-test. And one of them is one that we didn't see in the CEFR, and that's confidence. You saw that went beyond the CEFR. So in that regard, there were other things that arose out of the qualitative analysis that were not present at all in the CEFR, but are things that we might value in the language-related literature. So the opportunity to practice was another theme that emerged in the qualitative analysis. And opportunity to practice is not necessarily a language skill you would find on the CEFR, but it is definitely a language component that is of value. So I could say it provided a good framework, but it was also, in many ways, it is a bit limited, and it doesn't always reflect the language that our students are going to use. So this posed an additional challenge. So the examples I provided here were all in English, and the survey instruments themselves were also provided in English, but we also had students respond in various languages, including French and German at least, and some Spanish. And what we also recognize is there may have been limitations in the wording that we provided and how much that resonated with what the students thought they were doing. So the CEFR had to be translated in a way that would be more comprehensible to students. And what we found is their own articulation maybe provided a better guide for, if we were to do this going forward, how we would word some of the things. They may have been more productively worded in different ways.
Wonderful. We only have time for another 1 or 2 questions. And we have a few comments in the chat. David, for example, is saying that the comment about power in connection to the use of English was interesting, something to look into with projects like this. And Saka also wrote here that data invite further analysis of the variability between the groups and setting. And this is in connection to, I guess, my question. So yeah, I would be curious to see what you can find. We have one more logistical question from Patrick. He's asking, can we have access to the domains and their sub-competences on the web link before the report is out?
Let's see. I don't think so. I mean, and not because we're holding this back from you, but I just think that we're trying to finish the project concludes in December, and we're trying to meet our deadlines, and we have a few other things that are coming up in other reports. So I don't think we can produce additional material before then, but I think Sake has reassured us that November is when the reports are coming. What you can find on the website, the link is the surveys themselves, I believe, and the reflection portfolio. So I think you may not see the sub-competencies, but you can see how things are worded. So if you want, you can take a look at that for now. And when the report is published, you'll see more detailed background explaining their selection. Thank you. It looks like Chantelle is sharing the link again in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we just have another minute. If anyone has any questions, please post them right now. I have just one last question about, well, usually when we conduct studies of this scale, there are things that are missing. And we only realize when we already collected the data and analyzed, and we realized that there were factors that we did not account for. There were factors that became only visible as we started looking at the data. Is there something like that for you and for your team? Were there any discoveries that you thought you should have accounted for, but you didn't? And my other question is, what is next for you? Where are you moving forward? How are you moving forward from here with this project?
All right, so 2 questions. The first one is, I think when we started looking at the pilot data, we saw things that emerged that surprised us, and we tried to account for them. And then another thing that emerged was the fact that COVID happened. And so we had that happen in the middle of some of our exchanges. And so there was like a change of direction. And it's a superficial thing to say, but what we had were people who had to adapt. And there was a really wonderful presentation given a few weeks ago as part of EVOLV by partner teachers who were sharing certain things that came about as a result of the virtual exchange running during COVID, and how it provided a kind of personal support system, because many of these students were suddenly finding themselves isolated, and they were interacting with people whose countries were responding to the virus in different ways, but provided an inherent support network. So there are personal elements that we didn't, I think, look at to the same degree that we could look at more now, that maybe are not always I'm trying to think, there's certain things that we'll look in transversal skills that are easily commodified, and others that are more interpersonal that I think we could look at more. And this is me speaking. I don't speak for the rest of the EVOLV team on that. So I think we've been very busy looking at what we set out to examine, that it's only now as we're approaching the end that I think we can start to see what we would want to continue with. Now, going forward, I think that there's strong interest in doing a kind of analysis where we look at the relationship between skills in the different areas and the different kinds of partnerships. And this goes to whether you're looking at if you're doing it in a language you're learning or a language that you're not learning because you've mastered it. If this is triadic or dyadic, if there is a difference across disciplines, if we talk about those with portfolios and those without portfolios, there's a lot of data that we have collected that now is available to examine in a different way and not based on our initial research questions. So I think even though the project is ending, I think people will be picking that up and hopefully inviting other people to collaborate with them on that.
Wonderful. Well, unfortunately, we are out of time, and thank you all for your questions, and thank you, Shannon, for this insightful, fascinating talk. I myself look forward to reading the report and seeing what's going to come out of it and where we're going next. This is all very, very interesting. I want to remind everyone we have another session coming up in 15 minutes, in about 15 minutes, 11:30 Arizona time. And this session will be a very logical follow-up on Shannon's talk and her mention of COVID. The session will be focusing on a virtual teaching, intercultural teaching, online teaching in the era of COVID, in the pandemic. Please join us for this conversation at 11:30, and we'll see you in 15 minutes. Thank you, and thank you, Shannon. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.